Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. The Christmas Choice by Emma Ashwood, Chapter 1. Penny Black shut the door behind her and sank onto the filthy sidewalk. She didn't mind the filth, at least it didn't curse, blame, and insult her. Nor did she mind the curious looks from the neighbors or passers-by. She did care about the length of time it would take her father to go from raging drunk lunatic to passed out drunk. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, praying the tears away. There was a time when she cried every time he insulted her, every time he blamed her for her mother's death. But after 6 years of being the brunt of her father's verbal abuse, she had learned that tears didn't change her situation. If anything, tears made her situation even worse if her father spotted them. It was late summer, and soon the hot weather would give way to the cooler evenings of fall. She took a deep breath and wondered how her father had changed so since her mother's death. There had been a time when her father was a kind man, a man who cared for his family and provided for them. But that stopped the moment the dirt landed on her mother's casket in the cemetery on the wrong side of town. Her father had stopped working, insisting that it was now Penny's responsibility to care for him. At first, Penny didn't mind, knowing her father struggled with the loss of his wife. She had believed that once the grief had passed, her father would return to his job at the docks, but it was 6 years on, and that day hadn't yet come. Penny worked long hours for the seamstress in town. Some evenings her fingers bled from holding a needle all day, only to hand her wages over to her father, who spent it on alcohol instead of food or rent. Penny had soon learned to only give him a portion of her wages, seeing to the food and the rent herself, as well as the heat in winter. She pushed herself onto her feet and heard a crash from inside. They only had a few good cups and plates left. For a moment she considered going inside and begging him not to break the few items of crockery they had left, but she quickly decided against it. Instead, she glanced down the road towards the church. There would be no service tonight, but the doors would be open and it would be safe. Penny walked down the road, waving to the neighbors she knew. She watched mothers calling after their little ones, and a horse-drawn carriage trundling down their street. Although they lived in the poor boroughs of New York, every now and then a carriage would come through, if only by way of a thoroughfare to the other side of town. Penny often wondered about sitting in the safety of the carriage as an adult, looking out over the poor and the hungry. All the while assured of the pleasantries that came with a brownstone on the better side of town and more food than one could ever eat. A sigh escaped her. Penny would never have that experience, and so all her wondering was of little consequence. The church doors were open, and Penny walked inside. A few people were seated in the pews. Some she recognized as the homeless in their neighborhood, and others she didn't recognize at all. She slipped into a pew in the back and glanced at the cross in the front of the church before bowing her head in prayer. Dear Lord, please help me. I don't know how much longer I can stand this abuse and my father's drunkenness. I've tried to help him, but it seems he refuses to see the man he has become. How will I ever find my way out of this situation? I know you are a graceful Lord, and I beg of you to help me find a way to happiness and to love. Amen. Penny glanced up when she saw someone sliding into the pew beside her. Penny? Penny summoned a smile, although the weight of her home circumstances rested heavily on her shoulders. Louisa Alcott? Yes, I thought it was you I saw. I told my driver to pull over immediately. It's been a long time, hasn't it? Louisa put to her, looking fresh as a daisy. Penny and Louisa had shared a tutor before her mother passed away. Although only 6 years had passed since then, it felt like a lifetime ago. In a different life. A life in which her mother worked for the seamstress and her father was shift manager at the docks. Back then, they had lived in a nicer part of town, but when her father stopped working, they had moved to the boroughs. It has been very long, Penny admitted. She listened while Louisa spoke about her wonderful life. After her coming out ball, she had been introduced to a wealthy banker. She was married and now lived in one of the brownstones on the other side of town. Penny was about to ask what she was doing on this side of town when Louisa continued. I actually came this way with my carriage this morning to deliver a letter from a dear friend of mine. Louisa smiled with a soft sigh. My lady's maid grew up in this part of town. She once confided in me that she wanted a better life, one better than that of a lady's maid. Although father would have a coronary if I revealed it to him, I helped her become a mail-order bride. I received a letter this morning from her. She is happy and in love and living on a ranch in Montana with the man of her dreams. I am here to bring word to her mother, who has been fraught with worry since she left. Penny's brows drew together. A mail-order bride? Yes, Louisa laughed. Can you believe it? She wrote to a man in Montana, and after 6 months of exchanging letters, he proposed. She's as happy as a shiny new penny. Of course I need a new lady's maid, but I'm happy for her. Can you imagine living in this part of town? Penny frowned as the wheels in her mind began to turn. You say you need a new lady's maid? The idea of working for her friend was humiliating, but at least the wages would be good. Louisa frowned. Yes, do you have someone in mind? Penny was about to answer when the pastor approached them with a stern look. This is a place of worship, not a ladies' midday rendezvous. Louisa and Penny stood up as one and left the church, both properly chastised. Once outside on the sidewalk, Penny was suddenly without the courage to ask Louisa about the position of a lady's maid. Instead, her thoughts went to the previous lady's maid becoming a mail-order bride. I'd best get back home. Hugh will be expecting me when he returns from the bank, Louisa said brightly. Penny nodded and leaned in for an awkward hug, grateful that Louisa didn't mention her tattered clothes. It was good to see you, Louisa. You too, Penny. Please do keep in touch. Louisa reached into her reticule and pulled out a card. Write me. Penny nodded, glancing at the expensive stationery in her hand. She smiled and watched as her friend climbed into the beautiful carriage. Some might have been jealous to see the wealth of an old friend, but Penny wasn't. Louisa may have been living the life she had always dreamed of, but she had just given Penny an idea. A way to escape her father's wrath and possibly find love. With a plan in mind and a smile on her face, Penny crossed the road to the newsstand. She would find herself a husband in the West if it was the last thing she did. Chapter 2. Penny opened the letter with a smile on her face. It had been 2 months since she had written to George Simpson in response to his advertisement for a wife. She had written to 2 other men as well, but it was George's reply that had called to her heart. Over the last 2 months, they had corresponded with each other almost weekly, and whenever she heard from George, she couldn't help but smile at his description of Colorado. At the age of 25, George was ready to find love and start a family. He owned a cattle ranch and lived with his mother and his brother in the proximity of Idaho Springs. Through his letters, Penny learned that he was a kind and generous man who helped fund the local school while caring for his elderly mother. After his first letter, she had been hesitant to go through with her plan of becoming a mail-order bride. But after his 3rd letter and her father's downward spiral, Penny knew that she would be a fool not to follow her heart. She took a deep breath and read the letter that had arrived that morning. A smile curved her mouth as she read George's description of the sunset at the foothills of the mountains and the smell of the air before a thunderstorm. It sounded so different to the dank and musty 1-bedroom apartment she shared with her father. Most mornings it smelled of alcohol after her father had slept off his latest binge. The last sentence of the letter made her heart skip a beat. I believe the time has come for us to be honest with regard to our feelings. I feel that you are the woman I have been seeking as a wife, the woman I'd like to share my life with, and who I would be honored to have as the mother of my children. I've included a postal order to cover a train fare and enough money for the incidentals you might need along the way. Come to Colorado, Penny, marry me, and let me make you happy. A smile beamed on Penny's face as she wiped away a tear of joy. She had always imagined a marriage proposal made in person, but George's words were more earnest than any spoken word could ever have been. She reached for a sheet of paper to pen a reply when she heard her father cursing from down the road. Penny quickly hid the letter with the rest beneath the flour tin, knowing it would be the last place her father would look. He stumbled through the door, his eyes red-rimmed from drinking and his speech slurred. "What are you looking at? Ain't you never seen a man come home before? Where's the food? Haven't you cooked yet? You're a disgrace as a daughter." He stumbled over a footstool but righted himself before turning on Penny. A few moments before, she had planned on writing to George regarding her concern that they might be rushing things. Now, faced with her drunk and verbally abusive father, Penny knew that no decision could be considered rushed if it provided a means of escape from her current domestic situation. She jumped up and walked to the coal stove to prepare hash and eggs for her father. While she cooked, he insulted her choice of clothing and her worthlessness as a daughter and berated her for not making his bed. Penny didn't reply, keeping her back turned to him, praying for him to stop. Tears burned the back of her eyes as she thought of leaving New York. George Simpson might be offering her a life of privilege in a beautiful setting, but it still meant abandoning her father, her only living family. She felt her father's hand close over her upper arm like a vice before he flung her around. "Answer me when I'm talking to you." Penny's eyes widened with fear. Her father might have verbally abused her over the last 6 years, but he'd never laid a hand on her until now. "I'm sorry, Father. I'm just cooking your dinner," she quickly explained, biting back the tears. Prosody. Her father huffed and mumbled to himself as he moved to the kitchen table. Penny quickly finished cooking and set a plate before him, not even bothering to serve a helping for herself. Not that she had any semblance of an appetite. She cleaned the kitchen, waiting for her father to finish his meal and then pass out, all the while planning her escape. She wouldn't wait for the morning, and she wouldn't say goodbye. A man who treated his only daughter like filth didn't deserve any such consideration. For the last 6 years, she had been sewing to provide for them both. From the age of 13, she had funded his booze binges, but that came to an end tonight. She had very little money, certainly too little to cover the month's rent, but that was no longer her problem. It was time her father realized that he was a grown man and had to fend for himself instead of threatening Penny into doing it for him. He cursed when his plate was empty, criticizing her cooking before stumbling to bed. Penny pretended to be busy in the kitchen until his hacksaw snoring filled the small apartment. She mobilized herself with a look of determination on her face, grabbed a carpet bag from beneath her bed, and started filling it with her belongings. Within 30 minutes, she had packed everything that was of any value to her and had placed the last of her money on the kitchen table for her father to find. It would be his decision to spend whether to spend it on alcohol or pay the rent. She was done worrying about him. There came a time in every person's life when the realization hit that happiness had to be sought out and claimed, and that moment had arrived for Penny. She reached for George's letters beneath the flour tin and opened the last letter again. She was done thinking things over and praying for a change in her life. It was time for her to become the change she wanted to see, and that started with her leaving New York. Carrying her carpet bag, her coat, and her reticule, Penny took one last look around the apartment, and then she stepped out of the door. It was not lost on her that this step was in actual fact a giant leap necessary for her self-preservation and a better future. She would spend the night at the church in the hopes of the pastor not telling her to leave or chasing her away. When morning dawned, she would cash in the postal order to purchase whatever she would need for her journey and to begin her new life, and then she would make her way to the station. Over the last few weeks, she had kept an eye on train schedules heading west, hoping for this day to eventually come. There would be a train leaving late the following afternoon, and unless her father found her and stopped her before then, she would be on it. With her head lowered against the icy wind, Penny headed to the church. She didn't glance over her shoulder once, because she was well aware that the man sleeping it off in the apartment in which she had lived wasn't her father. That man was one who had allowed grief and alcohol to change him into someone she hadn't recognized in years. Chapter 3. Penny disembarked from the train in Idaho Springs, filled with hope and anticipation. The journey from the east had been long, and she was looking forward to finally reaching her destination. She was even more excited about finally meeting George Simpson. On the morning before she boarded the train in New York, she had written to George accepting his proposal and advising him of her expected time of arrival in Idaho Springs. Going by his letters, she knew that it was a 2-hour drive by wagon from his ranch to town, and she hoped that he had received the letter she had sent him, telling him when he could expect her in Idaho. On the first day of the journey, she found herself struggling with the guilt of leaving her father without saying goodbye. The 10 Commandments haunted her. How had she honored her father by leaving him with barely enough money for rent? It had taken her an entire day of reliving the previous 6 years to realize that had she stayed, she would only have been dragged under with him. It wasn't easy to leave all you knew in search of a brighter future, but Penny had no doubt that she had done the right thing. She couldn't wait to meet her future husband and see her future home. She stood on the platform with her carpet bag by her side and her reticule in hand and scanned the crowd for the handsome 25-year-old man. He had described himself as tall and handsome with black hair and blue eyes. Quite a few men fit the tall and handsome description, but none had black hair. Fear trickled down her spine. Had she traveled across the country only to find that George had changed his mind? A man approached her with a charming smile. He was tall with broad shoulders, but his eyes weren't blue. He had a mischievous grin that reminded her of a naughty little boy who could twist any tutor around his little finger. "Miss Black?" he asked curiously, with a grin that revealed a dimple in his cheek. Penny's heart skipped a beat at his charming face. His face was tanned by the sun, and his hands were rough from working on the ranch. He might have lied about his eye color, but the warm brown eyes searching her gaze were just as mesmerizing as any blue she had ever seen. "Yes? Welcome to Idaho Springs, miss. Can I take your bag?" he asked, stepping forward. He glanced down to meet her gaze, and Penny felt a blush color her cheeks. Her would-be husband was more attractive than she could ever have imagined. A smile curved her mouth. "Please. Thank you, Mr. Simpson." Penny batted her eyelids coyly. She couldn't believe that she was going to be a wife to this stunning man. He lifted her carpet bag as if it was a feather before turning to her with a charismatic grin. "It's a pleasure, but I ain't Mr. Simpson. Name's Billy Axel, ranch hand at the Simpson Ranch." A frown creased Penny's brow. "A ranch hand? Where's Mr. Simpson?" Billy shrugged, holding her gaze. "Mr. Simpson doesn't like traveling much. Asked me to fetch ya." Her smile wavered for a moment, but Penny kept it in place. "I see. Thank you, Mr. Axel." Billy chuckled, the sound making Penny's heart gallop in her chest. "I ain't no mister. You can just call me Billy." "You can call me Penny," Penny said, returning his smile. She wouldn't ponder on the fact that her future husband's ranch hand had made her heart gallop like it never had before. "That won't be fittin'. Mr. Simpson won't approve. Best we keep to Miss Black for now." Penny frowned, wondering when it would be fitting, and then she realized that he meant until she became Mrs. Simpson. She followed Billy to the wagon and climbed in the back while Billy took up position in the front. She had imagined her arrival in Idaho Springs much differently, but wouldn't allow doubt to seep into her excitement. As the wagon climbed over hills and carefully rocked down valleys, she couldn't stop looking around her. The beauty of Colorado was simply majestic. Large mountains towered in the distance, and lush fields spread as far as the eye could see. It was nothing like the dank and smelly, muddy streets of New York. The air smelled fresh, and there wasn't a sound except for birds singing in the trees and the wagon wheels crushing over traveled rocks. The beauty captivated her and made her realize that there could have been no better place for her to find a new home. After an hour, she couldn't bear sitting in the back for another moment. After spending the last few days on a train, she wanted to feel the wind in her hair and see all there was to see. "Billy?" she cried out, hoping he'd hear her. Almost immediately, the wagon came to a stop. She heard his feet hit the ground, and moments later his head appeared inside the wagon. "Miss Black, somethin' the matter?" Billy asked with a concerned look. Penny shook her head. "Not at all. I was just hoping I could sit up front. It's so beautiful here, I'd like to see it all." "The wind might mess your hair, miss," Billy said with a grin. Penny shrugged. "Then I'll fix it again." She climbed out before Billy could argue. As soon as she was seated beside him on the driver's seat, Billy sighed, glancing at her with a disbelieving grin. "Mr. Simpson is going to take it out on me for not treating you like a lady." Penny laughed. "I'm the furthest from a lady." As soon as the words left her mouth, she gasped. "I just meant I'll make it clear that it was my choice." Billy chuckled and met her gaze with humor. "You're the prettiest lady I've ever seen." A blush warmed Penny's cheeks, but she didn't dare to make eye contact with him. Instead, she turned to the mountains in the distance and took a deep breath, hoping that once she met her husband, she wouldn't even remember the charming ranch hand. The next hour passed in silence, except for Billy warning her to hang on every now and then. When the Simpson ranch finally came into sight, Penny's breath simply caught. It was a magnificent spread. Cattle roamed as far as the eye could see. The house was larger than any she'd ever seen in the city, but seemed somewhat incongruently to meld with the landscape rather than being an intrusion on it. She had understood from his letters that George was wealthy, but she hadn't imagined wealth to this extent. "It's beautiful," she said, almost unable to believe her eyes. Billy nodded. "Best spread hereabouts." He navigated the wagon over a bridge that crossed a small stream before following the road towards the mansion that was the ranch house, where she could make out two men and an elderly lady on the porch awaiting their arrival. Penny's eyes searched, but she couldn't make out George among the people she could see. The men on the porch were probably his father and his uncle, she reasoned when she climbed off the wagon. "Why is she sitting up front?" one of the two men demanded. Billy didn't cringe as she had expected he might at the harsh tone. Before he could answer, she smiled. "I was just so tired after being cooped up on board the train, and so I asked to sit up front." She stepped forward, waiting for her future husband to come out of the barn or the house. The older man stepped forward. His teeth were yellow and decayed. His hair, once black, was feathered with gray. Dull blue eyes hid behind bushy brows, and deep lines stretched from the corners of his eyes. He had a slight paunch and small, chubby hands. "I'm Penny Black. It's a pleasure to meet you. Might you tell me where George is?" The man chuckled, the sound sending chills down Penny's spine for some reason as he took her fingers in his soft and clammy hands. "Don't be ridiculous, Penny. I'm George." Horror, dread, and disgust fought for precedence as Penny summoned a smile. She had come to Colorado to escape only to find that she may have been tricked into marriage with a man the same age as the father from whom she had fled. Chapter 4. Billy clenched his teeth. It was as clear as the snow on the Rockies in the distance that George Simpson hadn't been completely honest with Penny about his particulars, most notably his age. He had heard this morning for the first time that George had landed himself a mail-order bride when George had tasked him with collecting her from the train. Billy had debated throughout his trip to Idaho Springs about warning the poor, unsuspecting woman about who and what her husband-to-be really was. He had finally convinced himself that it was none of his business and had vowed to stick to that rationalization until this moment. Penny Black seemed like a sweet young girl with stars in her eyes, and she didn't deserve the deceitful to be unequally yoked to a husband the likes of the arrogant George Simpson. He fisted his hands at his sides as guilt washed over him. He felt like the herder taking the sheep to slaughter for some reason. Penny Black was not his business, and yet he had never looked into the eyes of anyone before and felt his heart swell so with warmth as had happened when he looked into her green eyes earlier. At the age of 21, Billy had gone to his fair share of dances and met a few girls. Although they had raised slight interest and a small level of affection, no girl had ever made his head spin at first sight. He glanced at her horrified expression from the corner of his eye. Her hair was auburn, and in the late fall sun it seemed to catch fire. Her eyes reminded him of the fresh buds of grass that covered the fields in spring. Her skin was as light as cream and looked to be as smooth as satin to the touch. She was innocent and hopeful, and had no idea of the ruthless family she was about to become ensnared with. Billy shuffled in place, debating whether or not to speak out. If he did, it would not only cost him his job, it would certainly earn him a whipping and leave the poor Penny in the crosshairs. Before he could decide, George turned his round, reddened face to him with a narrowed, beady look. "Don't you have chores to get to? You've been in town the whole day? I don't pay you to drive around. I pay you to work." Billy bit down on his tongue, glancing at Penny one last time before he headed to the barn to take care of the horse. He had almost spat back at George that he'd only gone to town because the old man was too lazy to fetch his mail-order bride himself. He stalked back to the barn and prayed that God would have mercy on Penny. No one deserved to be tied to George Simpson or to have to share a home with his mean and evil-looking mother. As soon as he was alone in the barn, he let out the breath he had been holding, realizing his hands were quivering with anger. It wasn't fair that wealthy people could do as they pleased just because they could afford to. He had been a ranch hand since the age of 14 and knew more about cattle than George or his brother Elroy ever would. When they looked at cattle, all they saw was more wealth. They knew naught about branding, neutering, or moving the herds to prevent overgrazing. No, that was why they employed Billy to oversee the ranch hands. Elroy and George only ever remained indoors, drinking expensive whiskey inside the house to the sound of their nagging mother. It wasn't hard to understand why the brothers had never married. Billy was sure that anyone who had ever met the Simpsons couldn't stand the thought of spending more than a few minutes with them. He turned to the bay mare and sighed. "It's none of our business, Rosie. We'll just have to remind ourselves of that every day." The horse nickered as if in agreement. Billy sighed as he began untacking the horse, knowing full well that he had to remind himself of that more than a few times a day. The constant thoughts about Penny's wide green eyes and the fear and disappointment in them when she was introduced to her fiancé just exacerbated his discomfort. Penny glanced longingly in the direction Billy had taken before she turned back to George. She summoned a smile, wondering if this was a horrid trick of fate or her just deserts for abandoning her father. "Come meet my mother, Penny Black. Meet Lavina Simpson," George said, moving towards the other man and woman on the porch. Penny smiled at the older woman and wondered how George could have described his mother as a sweet and loving person. The old lady reminded her of a crow with her towering height, small frame, and beady eyes. Her white-gray hair was tied back in a tight bun, making her look even more imposing. "This is my baby brother Elroy," George introduced, pointing to the man. This one was fatter than George, with almost 3 chins riding beneath his face. His eyes were mean as they raked over Penny's body. She shivered and hoped it wasn't visible. "It's a pleasure to meet you both," Penny said, summoning a smile. "Come inside. The pastor has been waiting for you all afternoon," George said, walking into the large home without so much as offering to help with the carpet bag. Penny felt the tears prickle her eyes, but quickly blinked them away. What choice did she have? Before her was the biggest house she'd ever seen and the richest people she'd ever met. Behind her was nothing but Colorado wilderness. She couldn't head into the wilderness and chance bandits and wild animals. With a heavy sigh, she lifted her carpet bag and walked into the house. She was introduced to the pastor, who seemed a kindly man. "I'm sure you'd like to freshen up and change into something more appropriate for the occasion?" Penny smiled, grateful for a chance at a moment alone. A housekeeper showed her to a room. It was more luxurious than any she had seen in her life. She couldn't imagine even Louisa's room being furnished with such beautifully hand-carved English furniture or satin bedding. After washing her face, she changed into her best dress, still wrinkled from the journey, only moments before there was a knock at her door. "We don't have all day," George's voice boomed. Penny felt her anger lick at desperation as she opened the door. "Why did you lie to me about your age?" George seemed to be caught off guard for a moment before he shrugged. "I didn't lie about my age." "Yes, you did. In your letters, you told me you were tall, 25, and with black hair. She cocked her brow and let her eyes trail over his paunch before meeting his gaze again. If I said I was older, you wouldn't have written to me. Besides, we already have one old woman living here. We've got no use for another. A man's got to have something pretty to appreciate, doesn't he? I don't appreciate being lied to, Penny said sharply. George's eyes narrowed. And I don't like being questioned in the comfort of my own home, Miss Black. If you're not taken with my age or my hair or my slip of the pen, you know where the front door is, and I'm sure you'll find your way back to Idaho Springs. The threat was as clear in his voice as the fear clawing at Penny's heart. Either she bucked up and accepted her fate, or she would probably be eaten by wolves or murdered by ne'er-do-wells before the night was out. She summoned a smile and softened her gaze. I was just caught off guard, George dear. Of course I won't leave. I can't wait for us to start our life together. The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but they brought a grin to George's face. Good, then let's get hitched. Penny followed George down the stairs and into the parlor where his family and the pastor were waiting. She glanced longingly at the door, and for the first time wished that the Simpsons didn't live on a ranch or so far from the nearest town. When Penny took her place in front of the pastor, she tried to console herself with the knowledge that she would never go hungry again. She might not have a handsome husband or a kind mother-in-law, but at least she had a home and a bed, and she was far from her father's drunken insults. Chapter 5. During the first week on the Simpson ranch, Penny believed things would get better. But after 2 weeks, it was clear that life would only get worse. If she had thought the reception she had endured when arriving on the ranch had been cold, then the family's treatment of her could now be described as icy. She had been surprised to learn that the cook who had been there on her arrival had only been hired for the day, and that the housekeeper who had offered to press her dresses only came in once a week. The housekeeping, cooking, and cleaning were left to Penny. George Simpson hadn't wanted a wife to share his life with. No, he had wanted a servant young enough to withstand the vigorous work while also providing eye candy at his dining table. On the day of her wedding, they had enjoyed apple juice instead of the traditional alcohol, and Penny had been relieved that at least her new husband did not share a penchant for the bottle, as did her father. That relief was, however, short-lived when, after the pastor left, the expensive scotch was pulled out and enjoyed freely by the brothers. Before she had even removed the dress in which she had been married, Lavina had sat her down and made her duties clear to her. She had cried herself to sleep on her wedding night, knowing that she had been duped. A mail-order bride was a much cheaper option for the stingy Simpson family than hiring a housekeeper or a cook. Not only did they have a live-in servant, they had one with no choice but to obey. Over the first few days, she had managed her duties and kept her head down, hoping that if she proved her worth, the brothers would treat her more kindly. The night before, they had proved that they had no intention of treating her any better. She had cooked a meal of meat, potatoes, and freshly harvested greens. Rather than the gratitude she had expected for the effort, Lavina criticized the meat, and the men chastened her for wasting time on cooking when she could have been cleaning the library. She had cringed at the thought since she knew the brothers had spent the entire day drinking in the library, and it wasn't cleaning they had in mind. She woke up early that morning and kneeled in front of her bed, grateful that George hadn't insisted on his privileges as her husband yet. She closed her eyes. Dear Lord, please help me. I came here hoping to escape my father's abuse. I came here searching for love and happiness. Instead, I found more of the same, if not worse. I am truly grateful for having a home and food, but do I truly deserve their abuse and their disrespect? What have I done to deserve this life that brings me no joy? I can't imagine this is the life you had in mind for me, Lord. Please let me find a way out of this. Please don't let this be my future. Thank you for the blessings you have bestowed on me and on others. Amen. Penny held her eyes closed until she felt the warmth of God's grace spread through her heart, and only then did she get to her feet. She headed to the kitchen to begin with breakfast, knowing the brothers would be up first. Although they were early risers on most days, Penny hadn't seen either one of them leave the house since she got there. They sometimes stepped out onto the porch when the sun began its descent, but not once had she seen either of the men leave the house for the barn or sit a saddle to herd the cattle. It seemed as if the entire ranching operation was left to Billy and the ranch hands. All the Simpsons did was live off the profits, being stingy when it came to sharing that profit. Having brewed a pot of coffee, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Lovina standing in the door with an arched brow. "Don't look at me as if I'm intruding, young lady. This is and will always be my house." Penny quickly summoned a smile. "I was just startled, that's all. Good morning, Mrs. Simpson." "Good morning, Penny. It's time we spoke about your chores. It seems to me that you're spending too much time in the kitchen and too little on cleaning. The drapes haven't been hung out since you arrived, and the floor upstairs is simply unacceptable. You'll find wax in the closet beneath the sink. I expect that floor to be scrubbed and waxed by noon." Penny calculated the floor size and swallowed. On a good day, she'd manage half the upstairs floor, but in a few hours? "I'd like to do it properly. I'm sure you'd understand if it takes a little more time." "No, I won't. I'll understand if you fail in your duties that George will need to find another wife." The threat hung between them, the air in the kitchen stifling Penny's breath. If George divorced her or had their union annulled, she would never find a man willing to marry her. Certainly not in Colorado. Her reputation would be marred forever. "Of course, I'll get to it now. Would you like me to finish breakfast first?" "I'm sure I can finish the breakfast preparations, Miss Black." The words dripped from Lavina's mouth like acid. For a moment, Penny considered reminding her that she was her daughter-in-law and therefore Mrs. Simpson, but she held her tongue for fear of earning herself even more chores. She quickly found the wax, bucket, scrub brush, and cloth and headed upstairs. As she kneeled at the far end of the hallway, George stepped out of his room. The leering smile he gave her caused chills to course through her veins. He was the most disgusting man she had ever met, and she prayed nightly that he wouldn't insist on consummating their marriage. She quickly dipped the brush into the water and began scrubbing when Elroy appeared from the opposite end of the hallway. His big boot upset the bucket, soaking Penny's dress before his laughter boomed through the house. "George, better teach your wife to look where she's scrubbing, or perhaps it's a good thing I gave her a bath." George roared with laughter over her, but Penny didn't look up. She was mortified and humiliated and refused to let them see the tears bristling in her eyes. She waited until they descended the stairs before she collapsed into a bundle of tears in the puddle of water. Her heart clenched in her chest, wishing she could be anywhere but here. At that moment, even New York seemed a better option. She was stuck with an evil mother-in-law, a horrifying brother-in-law, and a husband who both disgusted and terrified her. Like Cinderella, she had no choice but to scrub the floors and wish for a Prince Charming in her future. Chapter 6. If the snowy cloak covering the Rockies wasn't an indication that winter had arrived in Colorado, then the blustering cold wind surely was. The only reprieve from the cold for Penny was either cooking in front of the large hearth or the time after dinner when she retired to light the fire in her room. Of course, she was rationed coal to burn every night, but she didn't mind. At least she had heat. The first snow of the season had fallen the night before, and there was a light dusting of snow covering the fields beyond the large home. Even the barn had a light coat of snow covering the roof. When Penny had woken up that morning, the sight had simply stolen her breath for a moment. It was magical, almost captivating in its beauty. For a brief moment, the joy of knowing Christmas was coming overwhelmed her before the reality of being not much more than a slave kicked in, reminding her of her circumstances. It only took a glance at her hands to hint at how she had spent her 6 weeks in Colorado. Her hands were chapped, her nails broken, and it didn't matter how many times she asked George for a skin cream. He insisted it was a waste of good money. She had almost reminded him he had done nothing to earn that money apart from inheriting the ranch his father had built. She stood in the kitchen shortly after breakfast, doing the dishes and watching the barn, deep in thought. She didn't know how long she had done so, but whenever she had the barn in her sight, she would look out for Billy. His tall frame and black hair had become the highlight of her day, the beam of kindness in a world of terror. Although she kept to her duties, the verbal abuse and threats never stopped. Twice she had considered running away, but Penny knew there was no way for her to survive in the wilderness, especially not in winter. George had provided her with an old coat of his mother's and a sturdy pair of boots, not because he cared, but because he would have to get someone in to do her chores were she to come down with a case of pneumonia. Penny dried off the last dish and placed it in the cupboard before carrying the basin out the back door. She swung the bucket of water before realizing Billy was directly in the line of fire. He gasped and quickly jumped out of the way before the dirty dishwater sloshed at his feet. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see you," Penny began before clutching a hand to her mouth. She expected him to berate her, but Billy chuckled instead. "You should be more careful. One could be whipped around these parts for tossing dishwater at people." Her shoulders relaxed and the tension seeped from her muscles as she returned his smile. "I'm sorry, really." "Really, don't mention it," Billy said, bumping the front of his hat up an inch. "How have you been?" She summoned a smile, knowing that if she confided in Billy, George would be rightfully angered. "It's all right. It's a roof over my head and food in my belly." Billy didn't smile or agree. Why did it feel as if he could see into her soul and read the truth there? "Yeah, I'm sure it's just dandy. Listen, why don't you find a chore that involves coming outside later and we can discuss the wonder of our lives?" His mouth twitched with a grin and revealed the dimple in his cheek. Penny couldn't help but return his smile as her heart skipped a beat. Why was it that the ranch hand understood her better and cared more than the man she called her husband? "I don't have any chores to do out in the barn." Billy narrowed his eyes with a twinkle of mischief in them. "Course you do. Don't you need to stock the fireplaces with wood?" Penny laughed. "You're right, that is a chore I haven't got to yet." Prosody. "I'll be waiting," Billy said, tipping his hat in greeting before looking at her again. "When you come, mind seeing if there's some cornbread lying around? Can only live so long on beans and hash." Penny smiled before she nodded. She didn't cook for the ranch hands, but she knew they got nothing but hash and beans to cook for themselves. George insisted that if they ate better, they'd start rustling his cattle. Sometimes George and Elroy's idiocy simply astonished her. How they had managed to keep the ranch going all this time was beyond her. Once her chores were done downstairs, Penny collected the wood basket and headed to the barn. The wind had picked up and it cut through her coat, but she kept her head down and kept walking. She didn't know why she wanted to see Billy. She just knew she had to grab the chance at being away from the Simpsons, even if only for a few minutes. She found him in the back of the barn crooning to a mare and her foal. The sight made her heart stop for a moment. She had known many men in her life, but she had never heard a man singing to an animal before. As his deep baritone voice carried to her across the stalls, her heart swelled in her chest. Why did it feel like she knew Billy Axel, although she hardly did at all? "There you are." Billy smiled as he moved towards her. "Don't look so frightened. The Simpsons hardly ever come into the barn." Penny nodded, still holding the basket for the wood. "I don't think they'll approve of us talking." "Well, they'll have to catch us first," Billy chuckled. "I've been here for going on 3 years, and in the last 3 years, the Simpson brothers have done no more than rant at me for doing something wrong when they knew nothing about it themselves." Penny sighed heavily. Why do they treat people that way? It's like they think they're better than anyone else. It's because they do. They're entitled, selfish, and don't care for anyone but their ma. Rumor has it she holds 50% of the purse strings and George the other 50. "And Elroy?" Penny asked, intrigued, as she began loading logs of wood into the basket. "Elroy? He's even meaner than his brother. Only difference is, he's got an evil side as well. I've seen him skin a rat for having the audacity to come into his room. Has to be something wrong with that one." "Why do you stay?" Penny asked, shocked that someone would choose to remain when they were well aware of the conditions they faced. Billy shrugged. Probably same reason you do. Ain't got nowhere else to go and no money to get me there. Penny sighed, shaking her head. Why does it always seem that the problem comes down to money? If I had money, I never would have answered that advertisement. If I had money, I would have left the moment I arrived on this ranch. If I had money, I would have bought this ranch simply because I wanted it. She let the words trail off on a dreamy smile. Seems to me you deserve much more than this ranch, Miss Penny. Seems to me you deserve someone who doesn't see you as only a hard laborer. Penny shrugged. Might be, but what we deserve is very seldom what we get. Their eyes met and held for a moment, and Penny wished things could have been different. If only she hadn't been fooled that first afternoon. If only she had asked them to postpone the wedding. There were so many if-onlys that Penny couldn't even remember them all as she headed back to the house burdened with the basket full of logs. Chapter 7. Penny's visits to the barn became more frequent over that week. Neither George nor Elroy complained that she fetched wood from the barn every day, although she was certain neither actually cared what she did as long as the house was clean and their meals were cooked. Her conversations with Billy had become the highlight of her day. Regardless of the insults or the mean comments from the Simpsons, when she stepped into the barn, she felt like a different person altogether. It was as if she stepped out of her horrible life and into a cocoon of kindness and happiness for a few minutes every day. During these conversations, she learned that Billy had lost his parents when he was just 12 years old. He began working as a ranch hand the following summer, and that had pretty much been his life ever since. He was a religious person and often spoke to her about passages in the gospel that captured his attention or his thoughts on the world and what could be done to change it. He became the friend she never had, the philosopher she could listen to for hours, the man she looked forward to spending time with regardless of her mean husband, berating them both at every opportunity. It was a nice day despite the snow that lay thick on the ground, with no cold breeze cutting over the fields or a hint of snowfall in sight. Penny couldn't help but be a little sad knowing she would have no excuse to fetch more wood today. Once the chores were done and the house was cleaned, it was already after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Penny headed to the kitchen to start preparing the soup, and Elroy joined her there. Small little thing, you need to get some more meat on your bones. George doesn't like his women looking like stick insects. He laughed at his own joke as he reached for a glass of milk. An eerie feeling came over Penny with the realization that she had never seen Elroy touch a drop of milk in all the time she'd been at their ranch. She glanced nervously towards the door, wishing for George to rescue her from whatever insult his brother had brewing, especially for her. She diced the carrots and slipped them into the soup before moving on to the onions, hoping that if she ignored Elroy, he would finally get the message. She heard him moving closer and clenched her teeth with anxiety. Wouldn't mind having a stick insect myself, though. Elroy leered from beside her when George's booming voice filled the kitchen. There you are, afraid of losing to me again in chess? George roared with laughter before glancing at the stove. If you're making soup, you can give it to ranch hands. Simpson men don't eat soup. She suppressed the sigh that escaped her, but continued stirring. At least the ranch hands would have a nice supper for a change. With both brothers in the kitchen, she decided now was as good a time as any to ask the question that had been on her mind since the first snow had fallen. George, what do you usually do for Christmas? Penny asked with a tentative smile. Christmas had always been her favorite time of year before her mother passed away. She hoped this Christmas would be one to remember again. George frowned. Nothing. We eat, we drink, we sleep, same as every other day. Why, you ask? Penny tried not to look too disappointed. Do we at least do something special for lunch? A tree, perhaps? Elroy snickered and Penny frowned, turning to George. I'm sorry, what's so funny? George shrugged. That you'd think I would waste money on decorations or a special meal. It's just a day like any other. Pa died on Christmas Day a few years back, and he didn't believe in wasting money. Don't see why we should. We honor Christmas by ignoring it, just like our pa did. Horrified, Penny turned back to the soup, hoping that they didn't see the disappointment on her face. How could anyone honor Christmas by ignoring it? Of course, it might be a little exaggerated as a religious holiday, but surely that was the point. What other time of year gave one the opportunity to give gifts and be merry in the spirit of the season? Her heart sank into her shoes as she remembered her last Christmas at home. Her father had been drunk, but at least she had a candle beside the small tree she had picked up in the street. Someone must have discarded it, but for Penny, it was the most precious tree ever. There had been no gifts or fancy meal to celebrate the occasion, but Penny had enjoyed it regardless. Thinking back now, it had been a pitiful Christmas, alone except for her drunk father who had passed out in his room. Given her current circumstances, however, that would have been preferential by far to doing anything at all. Chapter 8. A week later, Penny still couldn't get over the idea that the Simpsons wouldn't celebrate Christmas. Surely it was sacrilegious not to at least recognize the occasion? She kept her head down and tended to her chores, wishing she was anywhere in the world but on the Simpson ranch. George and his brother were locked in the library, embroiled in a chess battle, and Lavina was in her room writing letters to her family all over the country. Penny knew that she had to grab the chance when she could. She took up her coat and headed to the barn. She had only learned a week ago that unlike the other ranch hands who lived in a bunkhouse near the pasture, Billy lived by himself in the hayloft. In case the Simpsons caught her in the barn, she always took a basket along to collect the eggs. The chicken coop had been moved indoors due to the harsh weather, and she could use egg gathering as her excuse. It was a little after 5 in the afternoon when she walked into the barn. Billy came down from the hayloft with a friendly smile. "Aren't you a sight for sore eyes?" She smiled, shaking her head. "Do you think that it's pathetic that my favorite time of day is when I am here in the barn?" Billy chuckled. "Not in the least. Especially because my favorite time of day is having you come to the barn." Although neither had acknowledged the friendship growing between them, Penny couldn't help but feel her heart skip at the sight of him. Billy had become the one constant in her life that didn't insult, criticize, or humiliate her. She blushed lightly and wondered if Billy had a sweetheart in town. The thought caught her so off guard that she quickly cleared her throat to hide her humiliation. Although she was married to George Simpson, she didn't have even the slightest affection for him. But in the eyes of the Lord, her friendship with Billy would be wrong. Or would it, she wondered? Would God blame her for finding a friend in a world in which she was treated as a slave? She and Billy had done nothing to impede on her vows with George, and yet she couldn't help but feel slightly guilty that she looked forward to seeing him every day. "You look like you have something on your mind," Billy asked, moving closer. His warm brown eyes searched hers, and Penny couldn't help but smile. "Actually, there is. I learned a few days ago that the Simpsons don't celebrate Christmas. Can you believe that?" Billy nodded. "Yeah, I thought as much. Never had to take a tree up to the house, and I know George and Elroy wouldn't do it." "I can't believe it. It's the most wonderful time of the year, a time when you look forward to the future regardless of the past, and yet they choose to ignore it." She shook her head and took a seat on the milking stool. "Although it's been years since I spent a Christmas with family, I still celebrate every year, even if it's on my own. I bring up a small branch and decorate it with twigs and acorns I collect during the year and pretend to be surprised to find a new hat or a pair of shoes beneath it in the morning." He chuckled self-consciously. "I know it's pathetic." Penny couldn't help but smile. "It's not pathetic. I think it's sweet and testifies to the kind of person you are." "Maybe, but you know what I really do when I'm decorating that tree?" Billy asked, dragging a hand through his thick black hair. "I imagine that one day in the future, I'll be decorating a tree with my family. We'll drink coffee and talk about the year to come and the achievements of the year that passed. We'll live on our own ranch and have an outbuilding or two and a steadfast herd that provides for my family in a way that my parents could never provide for me." Penny smiled dreamily. It sounds like a nice thing to imagine. Are there any children in that dream? Billy nodded. A boy, of course. Maybe a girl or two to remind me that there is still sweetness in this world, no matter how tough a man needs to be. Penny couldn't help but nod. She had never allowed herself to dream of a future. The thought of being disappointed if she never got that dream terrified her too much to even imagine how different life could be. She sighed and glanced at the chicken coop. I had best get those eggs before the warden sets about looking for me. Billy chuckled. I take it that's Mrs. Simpson? Penny grinned. How'd you guess? By the way, she still makes her sons shrivel with a single look, and she has an innate dislike for me. Billy laughed. Those did add to the calculation, but actually it was because she's never had a kind word for me either. I wonder if it's hard being that unhappy and angry all the time. If it is, I'm sure their wealth makes it a little easier. Penny bit her tongue, knowing that she shouldn't have said that. Jealousy was the devil's work and she had never played into his hand before. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. We all have different paths and different lives, and just because the Simpsons are wealthy doesn't mean they're happy. Billy shook his head, holding her gaze. You're a sweet woman, Penny Black. Don't let them turn you bitter. Penny shook her head as she stood up and moved to the chicken coop. I'll try not to. She collected 6 eggs and headed back to the house to find Lavina waiting for her in the kitchen. What on earth do you plan on cooking that you need eggs? We don't like pies. We've made that much clear. Penny attempted a smile as she placed the basket on the table. Her heart was racing a mile a minute, but if she wanted to keep her friendship with Billy a secret, she needed to think fast. I know, I was planning on making a skillet fry. Penny looked very convincing, although she had no idea what a skillet fry was. She tried to think of something she could toss into the skillet with eggs, and onions and beef were the first to come to mind. Well, it better not be pie, Lavina said stiffly. Your husband was looking for you. Penny nodded, swallowing down the anxiousness. Why would George be looking for her? Since she had arrived on the Simpson ranch, George had never looked for her. I'll go see him now. Penny first checked the parlor before she headed to the library. She found George sitting by the fire nursing his drink. His cheeks were already pink, a clear indication that the drink in his hand wasn't his first. Where have you been? He slurred when she approached. I went to fetch eggs for dinner. Your mother mentioned you were looking for me. Yeah, Ma says she thinks Billy is stealing the money I give him to buy things in town. As of next week, you'll be making the trips to town with him. I won't hear nothing about it. You make a list, and I'll give you money. When you get back, Ma will check if you slipped some money into your own pocket. Penny quickly nodded. Without a doubt, she knew that Billy wouldn't steal, but if she defended his character, she might just land herself in hot water. At least it meant spending a day away from the ranch every week. I'll do the shopping in future. Good. His eyes trailed from her face over her dress to her shoes. Can you sew? The question was so out of the ordinary that Penny frowned. Yes. Why? While you're in town, get some fabric. I'm tired of seeing you dressed in rags. A man wants to be proud of his wife. Penny flinched. The last thing she wanted was to be pretty for George. Of course. She turned to leave, and he snatched her hand and spun her around. She gasped in terror, and George gave her a malicious grin as if he reveled in her fear. A chill raced down her spine, but she wouldn't let him know. She straightened her back and lifted her chin. Was there something else? George smirked. Not right now, but maybe later. She fled from the library, wishing there was something she could do. She earned no wages for her labor, which meant that she couldn't even save money to escape the Simpsons. Tears burned the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She prayed and hoped that this time God would grant her prayer to help her find an escape from the vile and ruthless Simpsons. Chapter 9. The first trip into town with Billy was quiet. George's suspicions made the air tense between them, both knowing it was wrong, but both knowing it was suspected. Penny tried her best to act cheerful, but she could see her presence was a reminder to Billy of George's distrust. They stopped at the haberdashery, which offered a beautiful variety of fabric, but Penny didn't buy any. She couldn't imagine sewing new dresses for herself, only to impress George. His leering looks and awkward comments had become more frequent, and although she tried her best to ignore them, it was almost impossible. Today was their third trip into town, and Penny couldn't help but look forward to spending the day with Billy. Lavina had been in an extra cruel mood that morning, and she was certain if she had stayed, her wicked mother-in-law would have thought up a horrible chore for her, such as scrubbing out the outhouse. It was a clear day without a single cloud in the sky. The Rockies stood tall in the distance, covered in their blanket of snow. Although there was a bite in the air, Penny didn't mind. She enjoyed the fresh air as opposed to the stink of tobacco that almost constantly hung in the air throughout the Simpson mansion. Billy stopped around the first corner and waited for Penny to join him in the front. She never climbed into the front in view of the house. Not only would George have something to say about it, she had no doubt in her mind that Billy would suffer some form of punishment as a result. She quickly moved around the wagon and accepted Billy's hand as she climbed up onto the driver's seat beside him. It always amazes me why someone would rather sit in the back when the view up front is so much better. Billy chuckled. What was the view like in New York? Penny shrugged before letting out a sigh. It was gray. A chuckle escaped her at the horrible description. Billy frowned. Gray? Yes. It's like it constantly rains there, and when it doesn't rain, the air is musty from the ships in the harbor. It's almost as if the smell of a developing first-rate city is tinged with manure and the unhappy faces of the poor. Penny shook her head. The buildings are big, bigger than any you've ever seen before, but they're built with gray bricks, just adding to the depressing view. In summer, it gets so hot that the stench from the outhouses hangs in the air and you're too afraid to hang out your laundry. Billy laughed. Well, that made up my mind. I won't be heading east then. Penny frowned and shifted to turn to Billy. You heading somewhere? Billy sighed. Someday, when I've saved up enough. I wish I could save up enough to leave. They don't even pay me wages, you know. Actually, it's a brilliant plan if you think about it. By getting me to marry George, I can't insist on anything. I wish things were different for you. You probably wish you were still back in gray and smelly New York. Penny frowned for a moment as she thought back to her life in New York and shook her head. No, although I don't like the Simpsons, I have food and shelter while living with them. Billy turned to her with a look of concern. What was your life like in New York, Penny? Penny chuckled wryly. Worse. She glanced out over the beautiful landscape and noticed the first buildings of Idaho Springs coming into view. She hadn't spoken of New York since arriving in Idaho Springs. For a moment, she considered telling Billy she'd rather talk about anything else, but she remembered how honest he had been about his past and knew it would be wrong to deny him an answer. Besides, he was the only friend she had. Surely she could be honest with him? We lived in a nice brownstone when I was little. I had a good tutor, and my parents were wonderful. All of that changed when my ma died of fever. Pa never truly recovered from losing her. Penny drew in a deep breath, steeling herself for the horrible part she was about to tell him. It didn't even occur to her that she was speaking about her parents as Ma and Pa rather than as mother and father. The West was slowly seeping into her blood. What happened? Billy asked softly. Penny smiled, shaking her head. Thinking back now, I'm not really sure. Pa lost his job as supervisor at the docks because he was always late for work after Ma's passing. At the time, I didn't know it was because he went gambling before work and drinking. Penny sighed. The drinking and the gambling became worse. We lost the house and moved to the Barrows. Pa refused to find a new job and gambled until we had no money left. I had to go to work. He insisted it was time for me to care for him. In the beginning, he took all my wages. Only later did I realize I had to keep some money hidden to pay for our rent and food. There were times when he found the money I kept aside and used it to buy drink as well. It wasn't much different than it is now. The insults, the demands, the chores, and the work. Only difference was our apartment was awful and we barely ever had food. When I got George's first letter, I was certain it was a sign from God that this would be my happily ever after. Instead, you just moved into a bigger house with the same old troubles." Billy sighed. "Why do you think some have all the luck and some have none?" Penny shrugged. "I won't even begin to think that I have the answer to that. All I know is that God is graceful, and He must have a plan for my life beyond this." "I'm sure He does, Penny. But how do you think you'll get to that life while you're held captive in this marriage to George Simpson?" Penny glanced at him with fear in her eyes because that had been on her mind for a while. "I'm not sure, but I have faith." Billy smiled generously. "Faith is more than most have. I just hate knowing they treat you the same as me. You deserve so much more." Penny turned to Billy with a curious look. He was the kindest man she had ever met, and it warmed her heart to know she could call him her friend. "So do you, Billy. So do you." No more was said about their circumstances. They arrived in Idaho Springs and did the shopping. The drive back was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Penny's gaze was on the mountains, but her mind was on Billy. Why couldn't she have written to a nice man like Billy? The more time she spent with Billy, the more she wished he had been the one with whom she had vowed to spend the rest of her life. They had no money, but Penny wasn't foolish enough to think that money would bring her happiness. She had been poor, and she now lived among wealth. And if there was one thing that Penny knew, it was that money didn't buy happiness. Only love, kindness, and faith could bring her happiness. She glanced at Billy out of the corner of her eye and wished she could share all three with him instead of George Simpson. When the ranch came into sight, a heaviness settled on her shoulders. How much longer could she stand being a slave to the Simpsons before she gave up? As if reading her mind, Billy turned to her with a kind look. "Don't lose hope. Don't let them break your spirit, because then you're letting them win." Penny nodded, knowing Billy was right. There might not be a solution in the near future, but she had to keep faith. In the meantime, she had to make sure that the Simpsons' awful treatment of her didn't break her spirit. "You too, don't let them break your spirit," Billy chuckled. "I've got the spirit of a Mustang, no breaking me." Penny smiled, although she knew that with enough brutality and bad treatment, any spirit could be broken, even that of the most confident wild Mustang. Chapter 10. The next 2 weeks flew by in a blur of cleaning the house from top to bottom between her usual chores. This time, Penny wasn't working on command of her mother-in-law, but because when she was busy, she didn't have time to ponder on the horror that was her life. She saw Billy on most days, and on the days she didn't see him, she missed him. Another reason for the spring clean she had initiated before Christmas. Guilt chewed at her heart because of the feelings she knew she had for Billy. There wasn't a single doubt in her mind that he had feelings for her as well, but neither was ready to admit it. Both knew that nothing could come of admitting their love for each other, especially with the Simpsons keeping a close watch on them. But at night, when the air was still and the landscape was dark, she dreamed of a life with Billy. She dreamed of the ranch of which he had spoken, and she dreamed of having his children and spending the rest of her days with the kindest man she had ever met. George had been looking a little pale of late, but Penny recognized that look. It was the same look her father had when she left. She had once heard of the skin taking on a yellow tinge from too much drink. He barely ate, and when he did, he complained about the food. Penny didn't take it personally, since he was too inebriated on most nights to even notice what he was eating. She would never say she hated him because it was wrong to hate, but she would admit to herself that she had an innate dislike for her husband. He was a fat, old, and mean man who took pleasure in insulting her. Her mother-in-law was even worse, making it clear that she only tolerated Penny because her presence meant they would not have to pay to have the work done. As for Elroy, Penny had learned to keep her distance. Her brother-in-law's leering looks and lewd comments frightened her more than her mother-in-law's wrath or her husband's verbal abuse. It was late afternoon, and Penny had just finished cleaning the parlor. Christmas was only 2 days away, and although she wouldn't be celebrating it with her husband and her new family, She couldn't help but hope that she'd have a moment to sneak away to the barn to see Billy. He had shown her the branch he had fashioned into a Christmas tree in the hayloft. It was small, but it held the same meaning as a large tree would. Penny gathered her cleaning materials, remembering the large Christmas trees in New York. Some were decorated with homemade trinkets and strings of color, others decorated with drawings made by children. A smile curved her mouth, knowing that one day she would let her children decorate the tree with drawings as well. After placing the cleaning supplies in the storage room off the kitchen, Penny started on dinner. She had just slipped the chopped onions into the hot skillet when she heard Lavina's horrified scream tear through the house. Penny's heart jumped into her throat, wondering what could have happened. She wouldn't be as presumptuous to think it was any of her business, but judging by Lavina's cry, something was very wrong. She was still stirring the onions when she heard another cry ring out. "Penny! Elroy! Come!" Penny frowned as she took the skillet off the stove and headed in the direction of Lavina's voice. Lavina was in the library. As Penny approached, Elroy appeared from the other direction. He shook his head, clearly bored with his mother's distress as he walked into the library before her. "Ma, what you fussin' about?" Elroy said before Penny heard his gasp of horror. Penny frowned, moving around Elroy to see the reason for the ado. Her hands flew to her mouth and her eyes were wide as she glanced at Lavina and Elroy in turn, before turning to the figure lying in front of the fireplace. "I think he's dead. My George is dead," Lavina wailed, sinking into a chair. Penny didn't know much about death, but she did know that glassy eyes and blue lips were a sure sign that her husband had given up the ghost. Elroy moved to the liquor cabinet, but Penny moved to George's side. She touched his forehead to find it ice cold. A frown creased her brow as she kneeled and laid her head on his chest. Not a single sound of life could be ascertained from his chest. There wasn't a breath slipping from his lips. He wasn't moving. Penny turned to Lavina, who was crying with loud wails. "He is dead," Elroy chuckled evilly. "I told him something was wrong. You're not supposed to turn yellow. Guess that makes me the head of the family now." Penny glanced at Elroy, horrified. His brother's body was barely cold, and all that he could think about was being the head of the family. She didn't know how things worked on a ranch, but the body needed to be buried. Knowing that Lavina was incapable of being of any use and that Elroy was unwilling, Penny rushed to the linen closet for a large sheet, returning to the library with it. She might not like the Simpsons, but in the face of loss, she couldn't help but feel for Lavina. She glanced at her mother-in-law before covering George with the sheet. Only once her husband was covered did it occur to Penny that she was now a widow. She pushed the thought aside and turned to Lavina and Elroy. "We need to arrange a funeral. I'm sure you'd like him to be buried on the ranch?" Lavina nodded, sniffling. "His pa is buried on the hill. He'd want to be buried there." "Right, the hill. Someone needs to go to town to arrange for the pastor, and we need to have the grave dug." "The hands. Billy and the hands," Lavina said quietly. Elroy nodded. "He was your husband. You'll make the arrangements." Penny frowned but nodded. "I'll go talk to Billy." She walked out of the library and waited for the sadness to overcome her, but she felt only relief. George had never shown her any kindness, but she would show him kindness in death. He would have a respectful funeral, and then she would leave the ranch. She had nowhere to go, but that didn't matter. She'd rather face a pack of rabid wolves than stay with the Simpsons. Chapter 11. The ranch hands held back, a few paces behind the family. Penny also held back, at least 2 paces behind Elroy and Lavina. Not out of respect, but because she couldn't stand the thought of grieving her husband. A husband who had lured her to his ranch with lies. A husband who had shown her no kindness, no love, and definitely no respect whatsoever. She wore black because it was expected. She held a handkerchief because the pastor would have questioned if she didn't. But Penny didn't cry. After finding George lying in front of the fireplace in the library the afternoon before, a somber cloud had rested over the Simpson ranch. Penny couldn't imagine anyone grieving the ruthless man who had finally succumbed to the drink he cherished more than his money, but she could see that Lavina's grief was real. For the first time since her arrival in Idaho Springs, Penny realized her mother-in-law did actually have a heart. It didn't matter that they were a family of mean, entitled, and selfish people. A loss was a loss regardless of the disposition of the ones who had to bury someone for whom they cared. There wasn't a doubt in her mind that Lavina had cared for George. He was her firstborn, her pride and joy, although the same couldn't be said of Elroy. Since Penny's return from the barn where she arranged for the ranch hands to start hacking through the frozen ground to dig a grave, Elroy had been walking around with a sneer. She knew as well as anyone else that he relished the thought of being the sole heir to the ranch now. Lavina might hold the purse strings, but Elroy was the one who held the purse. After serving dinner that was left untouched by Lavina, Penny noticed Billy and the men returning long after dark. She couldn't imagine it would have been easy to dig a grave at this time of year, but they had managed. The pastor had been sent for, and the town had been notified of George's passing, and the funeral would take place this morning. If Penny had wished for a Christmas filled with joy, this was completely the opposite. It was the morning of Christmas Eve when they reached the open grave. George's body was already waiting for its final resting place in the wagon, a short distance from the grave. The pastor stood with a solemn look at the head of the grave with a Bible in hand. What passage could bring Penny to grieve her husband? She took a deep breath as a fresh wave of guilt washed over her. There wasn't a single passage that could make her grieve for George. She glanced at Lavina, who sniffled quietly, and she felt her heart clench in her chest. Regardless of what or who Lavina was, Penny couldn't help but feel for the elderly lady. Her ice-blue gaze and stern expression were gone, replaced by a weariness, and for the first time Penny could truly see her age. She touched Lavina's arm when she sniffled again as the preacher began his sermon. Lavina gave her a hard look before stepping away, making it clear she didn't want Penny's support or pity. Penny sighed and caught sight of Billy standing on the other side of the grave. Their eyes met, and her heart skipped a beat. She was a widow now and no longer had George to consider. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life with Billy, and then the preacher asked for the coffin to be lowered. 8 men walked to the wagon and carried the coffin to the grave. It was placed on ropes, with men holding either side as it was lowered into the ground. Instead of dirt, Lavina and Elroy each stepped forward and tossed a handful of snow onto the coffin. The ranch hands, together with Billy, headed back to the ranch. It might be a funeral, but they had work to do, especially if they wanted to head home to enjoy Christmas Eve later that evening. Most would only return the day after Christmas, but not Billy. Billy had no family to go to and would spend Christmas Eve and Christmas Day in the hayloft, just as Penny had no choice but to spend it with the Simpsons. The rest of the day was quiet. Penny cooked, wishing she could have made something special for the occasion, but knowing that George's funeral had only served to lessen the possibility of Lavina or Elroy appreciating the sentiment. Standing in the kitchen and stirring the stew, Penny closed her eyes in prayer. Dear Lord, please wrap this family with comfort and kindness. Although I am not overly affectionate towards them, I know how hard today must have been for them. Not only did they lose their father on Christmas Day, but now George as well. Please bless Lavina, God. Please give her the strength she needs to overcome this as well. Please let Elroy realize that being the rightful owner of a large inheritance gives him the opportunity to help so many instead of using his wealth and power for cruelty. I know that you can offer redemption and comfort for this family. I ask you now to warm their hearts and bring them into the fold of your embrace. Amen. A sigh escaped her, knowing that her position with the Simpsons was now uncertain. Would they send her back to New York? Would they turn her out? While she cooked, the thoughts kept mulling over and over in her mind. It wasn't until they sat down for dinner that her questions were answered. Penny, now that you are a widow, we should speak about your future, Lavina said stiffly. I have spoken with Elroy, and we both feel that this is the only option for you. I know you might have hoped for a different outcome, but this is the only outcome that suits everyone. Penny nodded, refusing to let Lovina see that she would be grateful to be turned out. Without a dime to her name, Penny would rather beg in town than spend another day at the Simpsons' mercy. Lovina took a sip of water before she continued. The preacher will return tomorrow, and you and Elroy will be married. Penny's eyes flew up to see Elroy grinning lasciviously before she turned to Lovina. Elroy? Yes, surely you understand there is no other option. We can't have you living here for no reason. We're satisfied with your work, although you are lazy on most days. Elroy has been kind enough to take you under his wing and agree to make you his wife. But Penny shook her head, biting back the tears. I know, my darling, Elroy sneered. You'd like children. I can promise you we will have children. Horror washed over Penny as she turned her attention to her plate. She tried searching between the peas and the carrots for an answer, but there simply wasn't one. This morning, she had thought that being a widow was the best thing to have ever happened to her, only to realize now that it only put her in a worse situation than she had been in 2 days ago. Won't that be lovely? Although you'll need to wait an acceptable period of time. People will talk if she didn't grieve her husband first, Lovina pointed out, suddenly regaining her appetite. Penny didn't speak, listening as Lovina and Elroy planned a life for her worse than she had ever imagined. By the time dinner was over, Penny felt as if God had abandoned her. She couldn't marry Elroy. George might have been cruel, but he had never visited her room. She knew without a doubt that Elroy wouldn't hesitate. She didn't have a plan. All she knew was that she needed one before the preacher arrived the following day. Chapter 12. Penny headed to her bedroom after dinner. She collapsed on the bed in tears, her heart tearing into a million pieces at the thought of having to endure a life as Elroy's wife. She couldn't go through with it. She didn't know what to do and had a feeling that God had forsaken her. How could he allow this to happen? How could he see her marry one awful brother, only to have the next one already waiting to put a ring on her finger following the death of the first? She cried until there were no more tears left to cry, until her shoulders ached and her eyes were swollen. Knowing that tears wouldn't change her fate, she finally stood up to change into her nightclothes when she noticed the lantern burning in the hayloft. Tugging her bottom lip between her teeth, she knew it was a foolish idea, but she had to talk to someone who would better understand the hopelessness of her situation. Penny reached for her coat and opened her bedroom door. She glanced down the hallway first, listening to be sure that all was quiet before she carefully padded down the stairs. Her heart was racing as she walked, but she wouldn't turn back. She needed Billy's advice, and if anything, to see his Christmas tree to remind her that regardless of everything that happened today, it was still Christmas. It was freezing outside. Her footfalls crunched on the snow as she made her way across the yard to the barn. Her breath came out in small white puffs, her nose probably red, but she didn't care. Just as she was about to reach for the barn door, it opened. Billy stood just inside the door. He didn't say a word as he took in her swollen eyes and beaten-down expression. He stepped aside for Penny to enter the barn before drawing her into his arms. Penny couldn't remember the last time she had felt safe and cherished. Billy's strong frame held her as more tears started falling. When she finally stepped back, all cried out. A wry grin formed on her mouth. You know I'm not crying for George, right? Billy smiled before he nodded. I kind of hoped you weren't. A heavy sigh escaped Penny as she sat down on the milking stool and Billy leaned against a stall wall. I don't know what to do. I don't even know why I'm here. I just knew that I had to get out of that house. You're free. You should be relieved, Billy said, searching her face. Penny scoffed. Free? I wish. Lavina's already arranged for the preacher to return to the ranch tomorrow. I'm to marry Elroy next. A sob escaped her as she dropped her face in her hands. Billy's boots scuffed on the dirt floor as he moved towards her. He kneeled in front of her and lifted her chin with his finger. Penny, look at me. She sniffed away the tears and searched Billy's warm brown gaze. I don't know what to do. Billy's gaze hardened. Penny had seen anger and she had seen defeat in her life, but she had never seen determination quite like that clear in Billy's eyes. You're not marrying Elroy. George might have been a waste of good Colorado air, but his brother, I won't go there, but you're not going to marry him. Billy, Penny trailed off. She's going to make me. Just like they made me marry George when I arrived. This morning I thought, it doesn't matter, because tomorrow everything will go on as always, the only difference being I'll be Elroy's wife instead of his sister-in-law. Billy stood up and shook his head. He glanced up at the hayloft before turning back to Penny with a kind smile. Merry Christmas, Penny. Penny frowned. In the midst of the crisis that had become her life, that was the last thing she expected Billy to say. A small smile played on her mouth. Merry Christmas, Billy. Billy smiled and her heart skipped a beat. His mouth straightened into a grim line and his eyes narrowed. I don't have more than my last week's wages to my name, and I can't offer you the guarantee of having a shelter over your head or food in your belly, but I can promise you that you will be cared for and treated with respect. Don't marry Elroy. Run away with me. Penny shook her head, knowing the long day was playing tricks on her mind. I almost thought you said we should run away. Billy nodded. I did. It's the dead of winter. It'll be cold, and we'll probably need to spend a few nights in the woods while we figure out where to go. But I'll make a fire and hunt for food. I know it's not the happily ever after you dreamed of, Penny, but I'm very fond of you and can't stand the thought of you belonging to him. Billy's voice took on a deep timbre that warmed her heart. Suddenly, the wolves, the cold, and the vast wilderness seemed like a viable option. She would never consider it on her own, but with Billy by her side. When? The preacher is coming tomorrow? Where will we go? Billy laughed wryly. Anywhere but here. We'll leave tonight, as soon as we've grabbed the things we need. Tonight? Penny asked, suddenly realizing she was planning on running off on Christmas night into the woods with nothing but the few possessions she had brought with her to Idaho Springs. Yes, I won't steal a thing from them, but I will leave money for 2 bedrolls and a flint. Penny watched him, realizing he had thought this through. Was that why she had a yearning to come to the barn? Was fate pushing her in the direction of the barn because Billy had a plan to save her from a life as a slave to the Simpsons? I think I still have a few dimes left. I'll leave them for food. You won't leave them a single dime. You've worked like a slave for months. What little food you can take is much less than the wages they owe you. Penny sighed, knowing he was right. Are you sure about this? She glanced toward the barn door, knowing how cold it would be outside. I've never been more certain and sure of anything in my life. We'll find a way. I don't know how, but we'll find a way to chase our dreams. If we stay here, we'll never get a chance. Penny stood up, knowing she didn't even need to consider it. Running away with Billy was her best option by far. She was a widow and had no reason to stay on the ranch unless she married Elroy. She thought of his promise of having children and cringed. Billy was the first man who had treated her kindly, the first man who made her feel as if he truly cared. She knew without a doubt in her mind that he would give his life for her. She nodded firmly. We'll need to keep moving tonight. They'll be searching for us in the morning. Better dress warmly. The more you wear, the less we have to carry. Penny chuckled. Then I had better leave you now and get myself dressed. I'll be waiting, Billy said, stepping forward. Her breath caught when he framed her face with his hands. This is the right thing to do. I believe it with all my heart. You came to Idaho Springs for George, but fate brought you here for me. Her heart swelled in her chest, knowing Billy was right. Then fate had better help us once we step foot off this ranch. Fate will, and I have a good feeling that God's already looking out for us as well. He stepped back and smiled at her. Go on, be quick. Penny rushed across the yard towards the house, her heart racing in her chest. She headed to the kitchen first, putting a few pieces of bread and cheese in a basket, along with the 2 containers of water that they kept in the house. Quietly, she padded up the stairs to collect her things. She slipped another dress over her clothes, as well as a pair of pantaloons and 2 more pairs of socks, before quickly stashing the rest in her carpet bag. She glanced around the room and let out a grateful sigh. When she arrived, she had thought of her room as a sanctuary, But with time, she had learned it was no more than a gilded prison. She wouldn't miss it, just like she wouldn't miss the beautiful house she had once believed would be her home. Elroy's snoring could be heard from the other side of the house, but it wasn't Elroy she was afraid of when she padded out of her room. She feared Lovina. When she finally reached the bottom of the stairs, she let out the breath she had been holding. She slipped into the kitchen and collected the basket before glancing at the house one last time and stepping outside. Some might say she was crazy to run off in the middle of a snowy night, but some hadn't lived with the Simpsons and could never understand what a marriage to Elroy would mean for her. She heard a soft whistle and glanced towards the copse of trees behind the house. Billy was waiting for her at the edge of the trees, a large pack on his back and 2 bedrolls in his hand. His hat was low on his head, a bandana wrapped around his neck. A smile spread across Penny's face as she rushed towards him. This time, she wasn't chasing a dream. She was chasing her happiness, and without a doubt, she knew Billy was the person with whom she would share it. Chapter 13. It was the last day of the year. The fire was crackling and sending a light stream of smoke billowing into the dark heavens above. Penny held out her hands to warm them as she looked up at the stars. They were beautiful, as if each star was a speck of hope in the darkness that was her life. "Your bedroll is ready if you want to get to sleep," Billy said, joining her beside the fire. Penny smiled at him before returning her gaze to the stars. "In a while, I'm enjoying the view for now," Billy chuckled. "You stare up at the sky every night. Care to tell me what's so fascinating?" Penny shook her head. "Not really fascinating as much as it is glorious. I still can't believe we're still alive." Billy frowned. "You say that as if you expected that pack of wolves to pick us off one at a time. If you hadn't waved a fiery torch at them, I'm sure they would have." Penny laughed. In the weeks since they had escaped the Simpson ranch, their travels had been nothing if not an adventure. They had spent the first night putting as much distance between themselves and the ranch as possible. After sleeping for a few hours, they had continued walking until they found a safe place to camp for the night. The food she had brought with her was rationed evenly between them, and with Billy's keen hunting skills, they had not gone to bed hungry once. She didn't have a home, a bed, or any idea from whence her next meal would come, but Penny was happy. Billy hadn't mentioned anything about his affection for her again since they had walked away from the ranch. But he didn't have to. She could tell by the way he took care of her and by his uncompromising concern for her. She couldn't even count the number of times a day Billy asked her if she was all right, or offered to carry her bag regardless of his own burden. Billy had insisted on heading north, knowing the Simpsons would be searching for them in Idaho Springs. Penny had no idea what lay to the north, but she had survived in the wilderness for a week and believed she would see another town yet. Just today, they had come across a wagon trail. Billy insisted they follow it for a while, and they had eventually come across a family camped out for the night. He had told Penny to hide in the trees while he went to talk to the man. After a while, he had returned, and they had retreated back into the woods. The temperatures had fallen a little more each day, and Penny knew that it was best that they move as much as possible. She sighed contently and wondered why she was so happy. They had no more than a few dimes between them and no destination in mind. And yet Penny felt as if she could breathe for the first time since she had married George Simpson. "I was thinking that tomorrow we should start heading west," Billy said, tossing a twig into the flames. "West?" Penny asked with a frown. "Yes, that family I spoke to were heading to Craig. It's about 80 miles from here. If we're lucky, we can reach it within a week." "Craig? I've never heard of it," Penny said, as excitement started to bloom in her chest. A town, a place to find work and to build a new life were the only thoughts on her mind. Billy nodded. "I've heard of it, haven't been there though. It's a small town, much smaller than Idaho Springs. I thought we could stay there for a few weeks while we decide where to head next. I can find work at a livery or as a ranch hand. I can find work as a seamstress. I worked for a tailor in New York." Billy sighed. "I don't expect you to work. Haven't you worked enough?" Penny stuck out her chin defiantly. I don't expect you to care for me. I'll carry my own weight, Billy chuckled. You're right stubborn sometimes. Hinyi. I haven't been stubborn enough, I think, Penny admitted. Maybe if I was more stubborn, I would have never let my father drink us out of our house and cause us to lose everything we had. Maybe if I was stubborn, I wouldn't have married George Simpson. This is the first time I'm in charge of what happens to me, and I decide what I want to do. When we get to Craig, I'm going to work. If you want, Billy said with a grin. I hope our daughter has the same stubborn streak one day. Penny's gaze flew to Billy. Our daughter? Of course. I hope the boys are tough like me. I'll need to teach them how to ride and rope. They'll know everything about ranching before they turn 10. Billy? Penny asked hesitantly. Billy shrugged. Penny, if you don't know how I feel about you now, you'll never know. I'm going to ask you to marry me someday. When I do, I'll provide for you, and I'll have that family I always dreamed about. Penny couldn't stop the smile that spread on her face. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a good indication of where they were headed. She wanted to tell Billy that she didn't expect him to provide for her, but she knew for him it was a matter of pride. If he provided for her, she'd care for him. Because if Billy didn't know how she felt about him by now, he never would. She might have nothing and be sitting in the woods warming her hands by a fire, but she had love. She had never known what it would feel like to find love or to know that someone loved her, but she knew that Billy loved her, and she loved him. That love helped her find strength on the days that her feet were too tired to walk. That love warmed her during the cold nights. It gave her courage to carry on, because one day she and Billy would live that dream he had shared with her. Chapter 14. Penny was under no illusion that anything but the grace of God had kept them safe on their journey to Craig. When they arrived in town late in the afternoon on the day before they had been filthy, tired, and hungry, Billy had bartered their bedrolls to secure enough money to get them 2 rooms in the boarding house for the night. After ravishing 2 plates of food, Penny had slept the sleep of the dead. She had woken up in the morning feeling refreshed and ready to start her new life. She walked down the stairs of the small boarding house and noticed Billy already eating breakfast. Sleep well? Billy asked, standing up. He was scrubbed clean and had somehow managed to get a shave as well. He looked better than breakfast, Penny thought as she smiled and took a seat. Better than well. I can't remember the last time I slept so well. She leaned closer and whispered, Do we have money for breakfast? Billy smiled, included in the night's board. Penny nodded as the cook approached her with a plate stacked with biscuits and a fried egg. The aroma made her stomach grumble as she reached for her fork. I can't believe how hungry I still am, Billy laughed. It takes a day or 2 for your body to realize it's getting frequent meals again. I'd rather not ask how you know that, Penny said, taking a bite of the biscuit. I've been on trails a few times in my life. I'm heading out to find work this morning. I noticed 2 liveries on our way in yesterday, so I am going to take my chances there, Billy added before taking a sip of what Penny guessed was coffee. I'll be finding some work myself. The town isn't big, but I saw a general mercantile and a seamstress. Hopefully they're hiring. Billy nodded. If you want. The unsaid words hung in the air. I'll provide for you. Her heart warmed and a smile turned up her mouth. I want to. Should we take our bags with us? No, Billy said, glancing at the proprietor. I booked another night. Now I just have to find the money to pay for it. Penny nodded, knowing how dire their situation was. If they did not find work today, they would spend another night in the woods. Only difference was they no longer had the luxury of bedrolls. After breakfast, Penny headed upstairs and changed into a dress she had made herself. At least it was clean, if not starched and ironed. If she was going to find work as a seamstress, it would be good to have an example of her work to show. By the time she left the boarding house, Billy was already long gone. She made her way down the thoroughfare, praying that she would find work until she reached the sign for the seamstress shop. She opened the door and bells jingled, alerting the owner of her arrival. Be with you in a minute, someone called from the back. Penny took a minute to look around at the variety of fabrics, from the more affordable fabrics right up to the most expensive fabric she'd ever seen. She found it odd that it would be stocked in a small shop in the West, but didn't mention it when a woman appeared from the back. Penny judged her to be in her late 50s. Her hair was the color of snow, her complexion warm, and her smile broad. "Hello, dear. What can I do for you today?" Penny summoned a smile and took a deep breath. "Actually, I was hoping there was something I can do for you. I've just arrived in town, and I'm really quite desperate to find work." A frown creased the woman's brow, and Penny's heart sank into her shoes. "Tea? I never listen to a story without tea, and before I hire you, I'll need to hear that story." Penny couldn't decide if she was offended or relieved, but she followed the woman through to the back. Once 2 cups of tea were poured, she showed Penny to a seat and cocked a brow. "I'm listening. A young girl doesn't show up in Craig without a good explanation or a husband. Since I'm guessing you don't have a husband, I'd like to hear the explanation." For a moment, Penny considered leaving, but something in the lady's gaze made her relax. "My name is Penny Black. Simpson." "Elizabeth Smith," the lady introduced with a smile. "Please call me Lizzy. Everyone else does." "All right, Lizzy." Penny smiled and began right at the very beginning, on the day her mother had died. When she finished her story with having fought off wolves and walked for days on end, Lizzy nodded with a frown. "Can you sew?" Penny nodded. "I sewed this dress." Lizzy narrowed her gaze as her eyes trailed over Penny's dress before she stood up. "Well, we're not going to get any work done by sitting around all day." "I'm hired?" Penny asked, astonished. "You're hired," Lizzy said warmly. She continued to explain Penny's weekly wages, which was more than she had earned in New York, and then she showed Penny what needed to be done. By the time Penny headed back to the boarding house with an advance of her wages in her pocket, she couldn't wait to see Billy. She couldn't wait to tell him about Lizzy and how kind she was. After paying for their board for the rest of the week, Penny headed upstairs. A short while later, there was a knock on her door. "Penny, are you here?" Penny opened the door with a smile. "How was your day?" Billy chuckled, shaking his head. "Good, but I take it yours was as well." They headed downstairs for dinner, and Penny told him about Lizzy and her work. Billy had a surprise of his own. He had found work at the livery and was about to pay for their board when he found out she had already taken care of it. They had beef stew for dinner, although Penny doubted it was beef, but she didn't say a word. She was just about to head to bed when Billy reached for her hand. "Penny, I know I don't have much to offer you, but I'd like to ask you something." Penny frowned. "Of course, you've helped me start a new life. Anything." Billy laughed. "Be my wife?" The question brought a smile to her face. She had wondered how long it would be before she and Billy finally admitted their feelings for one another. The moment hadn't been planned, and it wasn't special, and yet it was the most special moment of her life. She looked into the eyes of the man she loved and nodded. "I'll marry you, Billy." Billy exhaled with relief. "For a moment there, I thought you'd decide differently. I've known mean men in my life, and I know without a doubt in my mind that you're not one of them. You're the kindest and most generous man I've ever met. I'd be honored to be your wife. I love you, Penny." The words were soft, humble, and slightly shy, but they were the exact words Penny needed. "I love you too, Billy." That night, when Billy walked her to her room, he didn't wish her good night. Instead, he framed her face the same way he had that night in the barn. He searched her eyes before brushing a tender kiss over her lips. Penny's whole heart warmed, knowing that this was what love should feel like. She blushed when he stepped away. "Good night, Billy." Billy tipped his hat before heading to his own room. Penny stepped into her room and knew that fate had just given her a chance at happiness, and this time she was going to grab it with both hands. They didn't have anything but their jobs and their love for each other, but it was more than they had the day before. Chapter 15. The wedding was small. The only people in attendance were Penny, Billy, and Lizzy, who had insisted she come. Although Penny had only known the lady for less than a week, it was nice to have someone who cared enough to attend the wedding. The preacher didn't look like the one that she had come to know in Idaho Springs. He was younger and almost looked as if he still had hope. Penny stood across from Billy and glanced at Lizzy, who beamed back. "Billy, Penny, are you ready?" the preacher asked, opening his Bible. Genesis 2:24. "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Penny listened as she looked into Billy's warm gaze. What better words could there be for a future with Billy? "Billy Axel, do you take Penny Black to be your wife? Will you have and hold her from this day forward for better or worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish her until death do you part?" Billy's face contorted into a beaming smile. "I sure do." Penny couldn't help but chuckle until the preacher turned to her with the same question. "I do," Penny said, feeling all the sadness and bad memories flee from her mind as she saw her future in Billy's gaze. "You have made these vows according to God's holy law and in his presence, and only death can put an end to what you have promised here today. I now pronounce you husband and wife." Penny and Billy nodded, and the preacher continued. "You may now kiss your bride." Billy stepped forward and gave her a chaste but tender kiss. When she opened her eyes, it was as Mrs. Axel. She turned and saw Lizzy brushing away a tear in haste. "I'd better get back to the shop. Congratulations, both of you. May you have all the happiness this world has to offer." Penny frowned when Lizzy rushed out of the small church and down the street, wondering why the lady seemed so upset. Billy turned to her with a glint of mischief in his gaze. "Come, I have a surprise for you." Penny laughed as she took his hand and followed him out of the church. They walked down the thoroughfare before Billy turned into one of the side streets. At the end of the street was a small cabin. Penny didn't know where Billy was taking her, but she loved the feel of his hand wrapped around hers. There wasn't a celebration, or even an announcement put in the local paper, and Penny didn't even care. All she cared about was being Mrs. Axel. She had never thought of herself as Mrs. Simpson and never would, but she loved that she was Billy's wife. "Welcome home, Mrs. Axel," Billy said proudly as he climbed the stairs onto the porch. Penny shook her head, confused. "Billy? We don't live here." "We do as of today," Billy said with grin. "Found out about it a couple of days ago. The owner is in Carson City until summer, and he has my boss taking care of the place. We can stay here until he gets back." "Can we afford the rent?" Penny asked, not wanting to get her hopes up. "We can, if we cut a few corners. Penny, this is a chance to have our own home, a chance to plan our future. We can start searching for something else soon. But for now, this is better than living in a boarding house. After all, we're married now." Penny couldn't help but smile. Ever since their arrival in Craig, it was as if the angels were finally smiling down on them. They both had jobs, they were finally married, and now had a home of their own. She stepped onto the porch and followed Billy to the front door. "It's beautiful," Billy chuckled. "It's not pretty, but it doesn't have to be, at least not yet." Before Penny could move towards the door, Billy scooped her up, making her laugh. "It's tradition to carry the bride over the threshold." As Billy set her down inside the cabin, a smile reached the corners of her mouth. The house had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a couch in front of the fireplace. Her heart filled with happiness as she turned to Billy with a smile. "Billy, it's simply perfect." Billy shrugged. "It's by no means perfect, but it is home. I couldn't imagine living in a boarding house with my wife. Things will be a little tight, but I'm sure we'll figure it out." Penny rushed into her husband's arms, knowing it didn't matter. They were dirt poor with no privileged future in sight, but she was in love. Billy treated her with respect and kindness and listened when she spoke. It was more than she could say about any of the other men that had been in her life before. Billy held on to her, and Penny leaned her head against his chest. "I never knew I could be this happy." Billy chuckled. "Me neither, but we can be happy later. Right now, I need to get back to the livery. I only got a few hours off." Penny nodded. "So did I. Thank you, Billy. If it hadn't been for you," Billy's eyes softened as he searched her face. "Penny, let's make a deal here and now. We'll never speak of the past again. From today, we only plan our future. We won't remember the Simpsons or anything that caused us pain in the past, because today, this moment, makes me realize that we can finally focus on our future." Penny laughed. That's a wonderful idea. Truly wonderful. When they walked out of the cabin to get back to work, neither minded that they couldn't take the day off. Both knew they couldn't afford to. As Penny walked back to the seamstress, she wondered what had happened to Lizzy. She had been happy one moment, and her eyes filled with tears the next. It might be her wedding day, but she would find out if there was anything she could do for Lizzy. Lizzy had shown her such kindness since they arrived. She couldn't imagine the lady suffering alone through whatever was troubling her. Chapter 16. Penny stepped into the shop and headed straight to the back. She found Lizzy sitting down at the sewing table, her eyes swollen from crying. Lizzy? Lizzy quickly wiped the tears from her cheeks and blinked before summoning a smile. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ruin your wedding. You did by no means ruin my wedding. In fact, you made it better. This dress you allowed me to wear is simply beautiful. Penny glanced down at the simple blue dress with lace trimming and smiled before turning her focus back on Lizzy. Is something the matter? Lizzy shook her head and sniffed again. It doesn't matter. It's been too long. Knowing that Lizzy needed a moment to compose herself, Penny went to change out of the borrowed dress before she made them each a cup of tea. When she returned, Lizzy was staring out the window with a distant look in her eyes. Would you like to talk about it? Penny asked carefully. Lizzy sighed, accepting the tea. I don't mind, although I don't know what use it will be. She took a sip of her tea before she began speaking. She didn't look at Penny. Her gaze was glued to the window with a vacant expression as she spoke. It happened about 3 years ago. The town was still new, and we didn't have a sheriff yet. Every now and then we had highwaymen coming through, making trouble, and other times we had bandits. Bandits? Lizzy asked, confused. Yes, seems the bandits weren't too happy about us building a town here. They would come with warnings, in droves of men, and ride off back into the wilderness. No one really ever took their warnings or threats seriously until one night. Lizzy shook her head and dabbed at the tear that slipped from her eye. I can still remember it as if it was yesterday. Annabelle was only 18 years old. She was our daughter and our pride and joy. Of course, we were living on the ranch back then. She was being courted by the mayor's son, and we were certain that a wedding was on the cards. We enjoyed a cup of tea together before bedtime and then headed to our rooms. I fell asleep quickly. I haven't since that night. Lizzy shook her head. I remember waking up to the cry of ruffians. I remember hearing the horse hooves clopping against the ground as they raced towards the house. I jumped out of bed and rushed to Annabelle's room, the room that had been her father's as a child. You see, my husband inherited the farm from his father, and he wanted nothing more than for his family to live there. The bandit leader, or at least I suspect it was the leader, kicked down my front door before finding me and Annabelle hiding in the room. He didn't talk much. He just pointed to Annabelle. No, Penny said, realizing Annabelle must have been about her age. Yes. He pointed to Annabelle, and 3 men came forward and took her. They spoke so that I could not hear, and then the leader turned to me with the most horrifying look I've ever seen. You're paying with your daughter because they refused to stop developing this town. They took her? Penny asked, horrified. Yes, they took her. I rushed into town as soon as they were gone, hoping to gather a posse of men to go after them, but the men just shrugged. They weren't going after bandits knowing they'd be massacred. Do they still come back? Penny asked, wondering how long it would be before bandits threatened to take everything she loved. No, they haven't been back since that night, and neither has my baby girl. I stood in that church just now and I thought of her. She would have been about your age. Maybe she's still alive? Penny asked hopefully. No, they wouldn't keep her for long. An extra mouth to feed. She's dead, and for some reason I see her in your eyes. You remind me of what I lost, and it doesn't matter how hard that is. You gave me a chance to be a mother again, even if it is a self-appointed role. Penny smiled as she hugged Lizzy. I'll accept you as a self-appointed mother any day of the week. I'm so sorry about Annabelle. Did they ever try to find her? Some did, but they never could. Lizzy shook her head. When I saw you standing there, I wondered if my girl would have married, if I would have become a grandmother. Lizzy sighed. She couldn't imagine how hard it must be for Lizzy to have lost her only daughter to criminals and never knowing what had become of her. She had suffered in her life, but she had never lost someone she loved to an unknown fate. "I'm so sorry to hear this," Penny finally said. "Don't be, but thanks for listening. Billy truly looks like a wonderful man. I'm sure you'll be very happy together." Penny smiled. "I think so too. He's a kind man, and if it weren't for him, the world needs more men like Billy. My husband was cut from the same cloth." They were quiet for a while before Penny asked, "Is that when you moved into town after your daughter?" "Yes, I couldn't stand the thought of being on that ranch. We hadn't ranched for quite some time after my husband died, but it was home. It's not far out of town, come to think of it. Don't you and Billy need a place to stay?" Penny thought of the small cabin in town and shook her head. "We're renting a cabin until summer, maybe then. When the ice melts, you come talk to me. I'm sure we can figure something out for you to live there. No use in having it stand empty." Penny smiled. Little by little, her future was coming together. First Billy, then the town of Craig, and now possibly living on a ranch on which Billy could pursue his dream of raising cattle. "I'll talk to Billy. Lizzy, thank you for the kindness you showed us today. Neither Billy nor I have family, and we both appreciated you being at our wedding. If there's ever anything we can do," Lizzy smiled, "I'll know who to ask. Well, we'd best get back to work. There's still a lot to do today." They got back to work, but Lizzy couldn't stop thinking about Annabelle. What fate the poor girl must have suffered, to have been captured by bandits as punishment to the townsfolk. Did the town of Craig know that they owed their livelihoods to Lizzy's daughter? She had heard of criminals causing trouble, but she had never heard of blatant kidnapping like this. Her heart squeezed in her chest, trying to imagine how hard it must be for Lizzy. She glanced at her employer and friend and knew that she would be including Annabelle in her prayers from that night forevermore. She knew the chances were slim that Annabelle would still be alive, but while there was hope, there would be prayer. Chapter 17. Penny couldn't remember ever being as happy as she was in Craig. Over the past few months, she and Billy had fallen into a routine. At first, she was afraid the routine would soon bore them, but after a month, she learned that routine could be comforting. There was comfort in sharing a cup of coffee every morning and tranquility in spending their evenings on the porch, holding hands and discussing their day along with their dreams for the future. Neither of the two was making enough money, so food was still scarce, especially with the rent added on, but Penny didn't mind. She became creative in her cooking. Billy was an eager diner, whether they ate stale bread or beef stew. Since learning about Lizzy's daughter, Annabelle, Penny made an extra effort to be a friend to her employer. They had invited Lizzy over for dinner more than a few times since their wedding, and they had always enjoyed her company when she accepted. Penny was learning so much from Lizzy, being that she was a skilled seamstress, and she couldn't wait to go to work every day. Not only did Lizzy teach her how to sew pretty pantalettes, but had even started to teach Penny about making hats. She enjoyed her work almost as much as she enjoyed married life. Billy was still working at the livery, but was hoping to find work as a seasonal ranch hand in summer, if the wages were better. Neither had mentioned the Simpsons or their pasts since the day of their wedding, and Penny preferred it that way. She often thought about her father and whether he would be as concerned about her welfare as Lizzy was for her daughter. But she couldn't imagine her father being concerned at all. On a whim, she had written him a letter a few weeks before. She had not given a return address or mentioned her whereabouts. She simply told him that she was happy and married and wished him all the best in the future. Every morning, Billy walked Penny down the thoroughfare to the shop. Spring was in the air and the cold was slowly receding in favor of warmer weather. Although Penny had heard of the scorching days that summer could bring, she looked forward to every one of them. It was as if the wildflowers blooming just outside of town were a sign of her life finally taking root and flourishing as well. "I'll pick you up the usual time today," Billy said before pressing a kiss to her cheek. Penny smiled. "I'll see you then, Mr. Axel." She turned to the shop only to find the door closed. It was very odd since Lizzy left it open in the mornings to air it out before their first customers called in for whatever reason. With a frown etched between her brows, she stepped closer and knocked. "Is something wrong?" Billy asked behind her. Penny shrugged. "I'm not sure, but this door is usually open." "Lizzy?" she called out, waiting for a reply. She waited a few moments before knocking again. No answer. She glanced at Billy before opening the door to find a letter on the floor bearing her name. Penny glanced at Billy with an anxious look before picking up the letter. "Billy, it's a letter." "Well then, read it. It doesn't seem she's here. Has she ever left town before?" "No, never," Penny said, shaking her head before she opened the letter and began reading it to Billy. "My dearest Penny and Billy, words cannot describe how grateful I am for your friendship. These last few months have given me renewed hope that love can survive even in the West. Yesterday afternoon, the sheriff came by after Penny left for home. The news he brought me was as startling as it still feels now, hours later. Annabelle is alive. She managed to escape the desperados that had held her captive all this time. She made her way to Cripple Creek, where she collapsed after telling the marshal who she was and where she was from. They don't have anything else for me at the moment, but asked me to go to Cripple Creek with haste. My daughter needs me. I'm sure you understand. I've thought this over and I believe what I'm doing to be right. Penny, I'd like you to have the shop. Care for it and expand it as you see fit. Every dime you make as of today is yours. I'm truly sorry that I didn't leave money for wages for this week, but I needed every penny I had for my plan to work. Billy, you've become the son I never had. Penny spent hours telling me about your capabilities at ranching. I've been trying to sell my ranch since Annabelle was taken. The memories of the ranch haunt me daily, and I could never imagine living there with my daughter ever again. It's yours. You and Penny deserve a new start, a place where you can build a home and a future for yourselves. I spoke to Penny about it in January, but I expect she thought I'd expect her to buy the ranch. Penny, my dear, you've shown me such kindness, and if this is something I can do for you, then accept it. Make me proud and build your life there. I won't be returning to Craig. Once I am reunited with Annabelle, we will use the money I have saved to build ourselves a new life, away from the memories of the heartache Craig caused us. I will write you again once I am situated and have a place to call home. Until then, please take care of each other and remember to thank God daily for the blessings you do have. May God be with you, and will you pray that He be with me on this journey? I will depart for Cripple Creek on a stagecoach very early in the morning before you arrive. See this as my farewell, and accept the deed and title to both the shop and the ranch. Yours truly, Elizabeth Ann Smith. Penny's jaw dropped as she turned to Billy in shock. Billy? Billy's brows rose before he dragged a hand through his hair. Did you read it right? Did she just give us the shop and the ranch? Penny nodded slowly, the letter slipping from her hands. It can't be. It's too much. Annabelle is alive. Can you imagine how happy she must be? Billy nodded as a smile broke on his face. She must be over the moon. We'll move to the ranch, since I understand her fear of returning there, but perhaps we should save some of the money from the shop and send it to her once we know where she is. Definitely. What do you think about 50%? Penny asked, glancing around the shop that was now hers. Perfect. Penny's face dropped as she glanced around the shop. I'm not getting wages this week. How are we going to survive? We'll be fine. We've got each other, and if I'm not mistaken, we now have a ranch as well. Best start packing because we're moving this weekend. Penny laughed, shaking her head. I can't believe it. Surely this can't be. Billy scooped her up and twirled her in the air. It's as right as rain, Mrs. Axel. Our luck has finally turned. If we had a ship to come in, it might just be in the form of a ranch outside of this hamlet that goes by the name of Craig. Penny smiled. And Lizzy's luck has also changed. I can't wait to hear from her. When Billy set her down, Penny turned and looked at the shop that was now hers. Not only would it help them to finally get on their feet, it would help them secure the future they had both been dreaming of for too long. Chapter 18. Lizzy and her husband had lived on the ranch while his parents were still living there. Slowly, her husband had taken over the running of the ranch from his father. Lizzy's mother-in-law had been a stalwart when Annabelle was born, teaching the new mother subtly how to raise a baby. And now, thanks to Lizzy's generosity and the Lord's blessing in saving Annabelle from certain death, Penny and Billy were on their way out to the ranch for the first time. Anticipation and excitement hung heavy in the air as they rode out to see what the future had in store for them. The ranch house was understandably not quite fit to be lived in, as it was when they first stepped across the threshold. It had stood empty, unloved, and untended for so many years that it was understandable that the doors hung on broken hinges and that some floorboards needed fixing. It was as certainly a solid structure, though, and the outbuildings of the homestead also only needed superficial repairs. Penny and Billy did as much as they could to make the house livable in the short time they had before moving all their few belongings into the fully furnished ranch house over the weekend. Penny did not change much in the business that Lizzy had so kindly handed over to her. The clientele had supported it the way it had always been run, and Penny was not about to fix anything that was not broken at this stage. Lord knew the ranch took all the fixing they could manage without thinking such effort should be spent on the business. Business was good. Penny handled the sewing and the customer care as if she had been born to it. On the matter of being born to a life, Billy wasted no time in buying a horse for himself and an old mare for his wife after they were settled on the ranch. Then he set about teaching his wife how to ride a horse. She was a natural, and within just days was riding alongside him to see all the ranch had to offer in the far-flung regions of it, away from the homestead. Life was good. Happily ever after was indeed in the making. Epilogue. Christmas Eve, Axel Ranch, Craig, Colorado. Penny took the ham from the oven and set it down on the kitchen table with a heavy sigh. Outside, the ranch was covered with a thick blanket of snow, but inside the cabin it was warm and welcoming. "Sit yourself down, child. You'll tire yourself out before dinner." Lizzy chastened as she shooed Penny into a chair. Penny chuckled. "I never thought it would be this hard." "Of course it is. That's why men can't do it," Lizzy said with a wink before turning around. "Annabelle, you take care of them taters and I'll see to the puddin'." Penny couldn't help but smile at Lizzy's take-charge attitude. She still couldn't believe it had been more than 18 months since she and Billy had moved to the ranch. They were poor and in love and had nothing but dreams to carry them through, and yet those dreams had helped them bring the ranch back to life. Billy had bought his first 5 cows a year before, and now he had a herd of 20. Little by little, he bought cattle while bartering for the best beef prices in the region. The shop was doing well under Penny's care, better than she could ever have dared to hope to expect. When she had received the first letter from Lizzy a month after her departure, she was glad to hear that Annabelle had not suffered unduly during her time as captive. In fact, she had fallen in love with the gang leader's younger brother, Bobby. He had helped Annabelle to escape and fled with her to Cripple Creek. He had asked for Lizzy's blessing to marry her daughter. Penny still couldn't believe that while the women were preparing a Christmas feast in the kitchen, Billy and Bobby were out in the barn discussing the differences in the way they raised cattle. So much had changed since that Christmas Eve 2 years ago. Not only had she finally found the happiness she had been looking for, but she had found a substitute mother in Lizzy. When Penny had written to her a few months ago asking her and her family to join them for Christmas on the ranch, she had been certain the reply would be a steadfast refusal. Lizzy had, however, surprised her by wholeheartedly accepting her invitation. It felt good to have a house filled with guests, the Christmas tree standing by the hearth, and the aroma of cooking adrift in the air. Penny just wished she wasn't so tired or that her back didn't ache as much. When she had learned she was pregnant earlier that year, she and Billy had been overjoyed. Not only could they afford to feed another mouth, they both looked forward to being the loving parents they never had themselves. Neither could wait to meet their firstborn or to revel in the first months that were reputed to be chaotic with a newborn in the house. Penny tried to sit up, but her back protested in pain. Lizzy turned to her with a frown. "When is that baby due to make its arrival?" Penny frowned. "The physician in town said January." "I think the physician in town was wrong," Annabelle said, moving closer. "In my time with the band, I learned a good deal about pregnant women. Every birth is different from what I learned. Some women suffer back pain, others abdominal pain, and some little pain at all. Has your water broken?" Penny shook her head. "No, thank you very much. I just think it's the cooking that's gotten to me. I'm sure it's nothing." The front door opened, and Billy and Bobby stepped inside. "It smells wonderful in here," Billy said, smiling before he noticed Penny. Concern shone in his eyes as he searched her gaze. "Penny, is something wrong?" Penny forced a smile. She pushed herself up. "I'm fine. My back just hurts a little." Prosody. Penny heard the sound of water gushing and turned to see who had overturned a pail of water inside the house. She was surprised to realize the puddle was at her feet, and she turned to Annabelle with fear shining in her gaze. "Annabelle, maybe I'm not so fine after all?" Annabelle laughed. "You're fine. I just suggest we get you to a bed." Annabelle turned to speak to Bobby before turning to Lizzy. "Ma, you go with Lizzy while I boil the water and get some towels." "What's happening?" Billy asked, confused by the sudden commands. Lizzy walked to Billy and smiled warmly at him. "You're becoming a pa, Billy." "Now?" Billy asked, turning to Penny with a terrified expression. Penny laughed, shaking her head. "You're ready, Billy. Believe me, I'm the one who has no idea how to do this." "Don't worry, you'll be fine," Annabelle said, chuckling as she helped Penny to the bedroom. Later, when the fire had burned down to embers and the sky showed the first signs of twilight, Penny finally held her son in her arms. He was pink and had chubby cheeks, but he looked at her with so much love that her heart simply burst. Annabelle had guided her every step of the way, and before she knew it, she had given birth to a healthy boy. Later, she would ponder on how different things might have been if Annabelle hadn't been there. But for now, she would revel in being a mother. A soft knock at the door made her turn to find Billy stepping in with his hat in his hand. His eyes searched Penny's before settling on his son. "Come, Billy, come meet your son." Billy's eyes shone with emotion like only a new father's could as he walked towards the bed. He sat down beside Penny and looked at his son before fixing his eyes on Penny. "It is finally here, Penny." Penny nodded. "He's a little early, but you're right. He's here." Billy shook his head. "I didn't mean the baby, Penny. I meant our happily ever after is finally here." Penny felt a tear slip over her cheek as she pressed a kiss to her baby boy's head. "You're right. It's finally here." She closed her eyes, and the memories of all her unhappiness played before her eyes as a ruthless reminder of how far she had come. When she opened her eyes, she looked into Billy's warm brown gaze and knew that every single hardship she had to face had brought her to this moment. "I love you, Billy. I love you more. I even love this little one. What will we name him?" Penny glanced at her son and smiled up at her husband. "Noel, Jeffrey, Thomas, Axel." Billy frowned before a smile split his face. "Noel for Christmas, Jeffrey for my pa, and Thomas for Lizzy's husband who started this ranch." Penny nodded. "I always knew you were as sharp as a tack." With their newborn by their side, the Axel family stepped into the kitchen to sit down for Christmas Eve dinner. They spent their first Christmas as a family, surrounded by love, friendship, and more dreams for the future, but not before thanking the Lord who had made it all possible.